I always like to grow beans every year, but because of our cool climate, I mainly grow them in the polytunnel and mainly for eating as fresh green pods. But I have become more interested in trying to grow beans as a dried seed as a storable vegetable protein. This is something that I have explored a little bit in the past, mainly by letting a few pods in the plants dry and produce seeds, for seed saving and to eat some if there is enough. This past year, I tried to produce a lot more, growing bean plants dedicated for producing dried seed. And it is possible to produce dried bean seeds, even in our cool climate outside, if I grow the right type of bean, but I'm still not sure whether it's worth it, whether I'd consider it a really viable crop. Here in Ireland, we have a tough climate for growing beans. It is rarely warm enough for many of these plants that prefer decent warmth, and the frost-free growing season can be quite short, and we tend to get a lot of wind. We also tend to get a fair amount of rain later in the summer, just as the pods are starting to mature, so it can be difficult to get them to dry properly without decay. I usually grow crops of broad beans outside, mainly for the fresh green seed, and I've also grown lots of runner beans outside, which will produce a fair amount of tender green pods if it is not too windy. I have left some of the pods of both of these different species of beans to mature, collecting the dried seed. The broad bean seeds are useful to use in the kitchen, though I generally prefer to remove the tough outer skin, but the runner bean seeds have surprisingly tender skins and are quite tasty. Both of these types of beans are different species to the bean plants that conventionally are grown for the tender pods and dried seed. And it is this more common bean species that I have difficulty growing, outside at least. I can get a great crop of green beans from the climbing or pole versions of these bean plants in the warmer and sheltered conditions of the polytunnel. And the overhead structure makes it easier to support these vining plants. The bush or dwarf versions of these plants also grow reasonably well in the polytunnel, and I have been able to get some pods off of plants grown outside, but they are generally less productive than the climbing plants. So I grow enough of these plants to have lots of fresh pods throughout the summer and enough to freeze, pickle, or process for the rest of the year. It would be great to be able to do the same with the dried bean seeds, but this can be more difficult even in the polytunnel, and I figure that it would probably take a lot more space to get a similarly useful crop. This past year I decided to try producing dried beans as a separate crop, both in the polytunnel and outside. In the space between two of the older polytunnels, I planted pots of seedlings at the base of security fencing panel that I have, and I thinned the young plants to 3 plants per station. I had 4 stations of runner bean plants and 4 stations of Borlato climbing beans, which is a variety bred for seeds, and 2 stations of a Romano type of climbing bean that I quite like the fresh pods of, and I wanted to see if this could possibly be a dual purpose variety. This was 10 stations and about 30 plants in total, which I protected from the wind for a few weeks with a crop cover. These plants grew fairly slowly as we did not get very warm weather this past summer, but the runner bean plants grew stronger than the more conventional beans, which I had expected. I let the plants continue to grow and the pods to mature and dry in the wind with very little other care, and thankfully we did not get really wet weather at the end of the growing season. By the time I got around to harvesting the pods, many of the seeds had mostly dried inside, but I set the seeds inside to dry even more before crushing and winnowing the pods to collect mostly clean seeds. Overall, I was not impressed with the amount of clean seeds that I was able to harvest from this planting outside. There were a lot of decayed or damaged seeds that I had to pick out manually, and even some of the better quality seeds had surface discoloration. So there were a lot of seeds that I ended up discarding. Overall, there were a lot more runner bean seeds, which were also bigger seeds, a moderate amount of Borlato seeds, and the Romano type produced very few seeds, but I did plant fewer of this variety. So I separated out the amount of seeds that would have been produced on each plant on average, and the difference was quite striking. Each of the Borlato and Romano type of bean plants produced a smaller number of smaller seeds, and it really didn't seem worth the effort. Each of the runner bean plants produced more seeds than the others that were also bigger, so the yield or harvest per plant was bigger. But there's still only about 63 grams per plant, or 190 grams per station of 3 plants. If I'd only grown runner bean plants in this planting outside, I might have ended up with almost 2 kilograms of dried seed from a 3.5 meter long row, which is a substantial amount of beans. So growing my own runner bean seeds outside is possible, and if the weather had been warmer this past summer and perhaps with better soil conditions, the yield might have even been better. But I'm still not sure if it is worth the effort and the infrastructure that I have to put up to allow these beans to climb, especially if I can buy dried bean seeds fairly cheaply. In one of the larger polytunnels, I decided to dedicate one full bed to growing climbing beans specifically for producing dried seed, separate from the plants that I was growing for harvesting the fresh green pods. I direct sowed 36 stations down the length of the bed, spaced about 50 centimeters apart, and thinned each station to 3 plants to climb up a length of twine tied to the overhead wire. I sowed the same runner bean, borlato bean, and romano bean varieties that had grown outside. I also bought seeds for 2 other conventional climbing bean varieties that were apparently bred for dried seed production, and 1 runner bean variety that was bred for producing large white seeds. I had planned for 6 stations or 18 plants of each variety, but I didn't have enough seeds for the new runner bean variety, so I only planted 2 stations with this white seed. The other runner bean variety that I normally grow with the purple seeds ended up with 10 stations. All of these plants grew well, as expected, in the warmer and calm conditions of the polytunnel. I pruned off the top of the vines a few times when they reached the plastic to prevent the plants from becoming too crowded so high up in the polytunnel. I was also hoping that this would encourage the plants to focus on the existing pods, but I suspect it just encouraged the plants to send out more side shoots. I did take the time to discourage these side shoots from spreading out too much to contain the plants a bit and reduce the amount of mixing of the varieties. But apart from that, the only main job was harvesting the pods, a task that I finally got around to doing later in the season than I had intended. There were a lot of seeds that had decayed, and some of this decay might have been prevented if I'd picked the pods earlier. But it was also interesting to see how many seeds simply failed to mature, and the plants probably needed a longer and warmer growing season than they had even in the polytunnel. When picking the pods from the runner bean plants, I noticed that there was a lot fewer pods than I had expected on many of the plants. But the plants at the south end of the row, closest to the opening at the end of the polytunnel, had produced a lot more pods. This might have been partially due to more sunlight and space, but I suspect that these plants were blown around in the wind a lot more than the other plants, which might have improved the pollination of the flowers. The flowers of the more common type of bean plants apparently do not need pollination, but the runner bean plants are from a different species and need more help with pollination, either by the wind or bees shaking the flowers. So it seems that many of the flowers on these plants didn't set, leading to fewer pods to harvest and a lower yield of seeds. Separating out the amount of seeds produced on average for each station, the purple-seeded variety of runner beans produced only 165 grams of seeds per station of 3 plants. This was less than the 190 grams per station of the same variety of plants produced outside, and this was disappointing, especially as so much valuable space in the polytunnel had been taken up by these plants. The white-seeded variety of runner bean plants produced only 123 grams per station, with much smaller pods, often containing only 1 seed. These seeds were really big and quite interesting to cook with, but I don't think they were worth it if the space is limited. Perhaps this variety will grow better outside with better pollination, which I want to try next year. The 4 varieties of the more conventional climbing beans produced a reasonable amount of dried seeds, but less of a yield than I expected. The Romano type of plants produced lots of large pods, but I think this is where a lot of the focus and energy of the plant goes, rather than into the white seed, producing less than 150 grams of dried seed per station. One of the new varieties that I recently bought in produced about the same yield, even though these plants were apparently bred for producing the dried brown seed. The other new variety produced a bit more per station with smaller pods, and these two-tone seeds are quite interesting. The borlato beans produced the most, with almost 240 grams of dried seeds from each station. So on average, I was able to harvest only 180 grams of dried seeds from the different varieties from each station of 3 plants. This was a lower yield than I expected, and there might have been a few factors that had reduced the yield of these plants this past year, but it's still more than 3 times what these same varieties were able to produce outside, so these plants do produce better in the polytunnel. So I was able to harvest just over 1 kilogram of dried beans in total from the planting outside, which equates to about 330 grams per meter of the bed. Inside the polytunnel, I was able to harvest a total of 6 kilograms of dried beans, which equates to about 325 grams per meter, which is almost identical to the yields outside. And the runner beans outside produced more than the best producing borlato beans in the polytunnel. I think this is quite interesting and not what I expected. It seems that the runner beans can produce a lot more dried beans than the more conventional climbing beans in this climate, but only outside if there is adequate pollination of the flowers. It takes a lot more effort and potentially additional cost to set up some kind of structure for the beans to climb outside. But if I have the space and the materials or infrastructure, this seems like a viable option for producing dried runner bean seeds. But if I did want to produce some more conventional dried beans in Ireland, it seems I would need to produce them in the polytunnel, at least for the climbing bean plants. And these are fairly easy to grow in this context, as I just need to hang a length of twine from the polytunnel structure. And these plants don't need the flowers pollinated. But the yield of about 240 grams of dried seed from each twine supporting 3 bean plants is quite low, especially compared to the amount of space that they take up, and they can cause quite a bit of overshadowing of adjacent crops. In comparison, I've been able to harvest several kilograms of fresh green bean pods from 3 bean plants grown in a similar way, which is a lot more valuable than a quarter kilogram of dried beans. I can easily buy many different types of dried bean seeds that are produced in other parts of the world that are much more appropriate for this type of storage crop. But it's not so easy to buy decent quality fresh green beans around here, and a lot more expensive. So it is possible to produce dried beans in the polytunnel and outside in the climate that we have here in Ireland, if I adapt my diet to eat the types of beans that grow well in each situation. But it does take a fair amount of effort and uses up space that could be much more valuable for other crops. So I'm not sure trying to grow enough of our own dried beans to last a full year is a useful thing to do. But I will continue to explore to see what happens in different years with different weather conditions and to explore different varieties. And it's still nice to have at least a small amount of our own dried beans to eat. I'm filming and uploading this video on the last day of 2024, so Happy New Year to everybody. This past year has been quite interesting in a number of different ways, and it looks like 2025 is going to be equally interesting, if not more so. In response to everything that's going on, both in the wider world and in my own life, I'm planning to make a few changes to what I do in the gardens and who I grow with. And I plan to make a few videos about that in the near future. But until then, thank you for watching.